Okay, let's talk Greek philosophical thought. A warm-up here for you guys. The supreme intellectual invention of the Greeks is a special search for knowledge called philosophy, the attempt to use reason to discover why things are as they are. Philosophy is born when people are no longer satisfied with supernatural and mythical explanations of the world or of human behavior. The high mark of philosophical thought developed in Greece around 600 BC. Why? Lots going on at this time. You've got tyrannical reformers, you've got your Draco, Solon, Pisistratus, Cleisthenes, the development of the Poli system. You have colonization of the Mediterranean. Now with the colonization of the Mediterranean, remember, they're coming into contact with other groups, other ideas, there's cultural diffusion, there's a lot of influences from outside of these independent city-states coming into Greece, as well as the shared knowledge of the independent city-states with each other. The Greek alphabet and the Homeric epics, the ability to share this knowledge through the Greek alphabet and the common bond of the Homeric epics is going to also lead to it as well. Of course, later on, during a real high mark in Greek philosophical thought, you're going to have the backdrop of the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. Both of these wars are going to change how particularly Athens views itself and its place in the world, and so it's going to have a tremendous impact on what is being written and how people are thinking about the world around them. It's not just this independent idea that develops for no reason. There are reasons for it. Pre-classical era, remember, you just have the Greek mythology. Individual patron gods, each one has their own sort of role to fill upon Mount Olympus. Also in the pre-classical era, you have the epic poems of Homer, the 9th century, the Iliad and the Odyssey, heavy influence by gods, interacting, intervening. You have Hesiod, farm life and hard labor. You have Sappho, the poetess of love. But in the 600s, you start to see these tyrannical reformers. You start to see a shift in focus is really what's going on, to the here and now. Not so much on the afterlife, but on what we start to see in Greek everyday life. And then, of course, your Persian Wars, the Athenian Empire, the formation that we talked about back in Chapter 2, the formation of the Delian League, and the later Peloponnesian conflict. So let's talk Greek philosophy. Your earliest group of philosophers, you don't need to know any of these guys by name, but we talked about them in the last presentation, are the Sophists, group of traveling teachers in ancient Greece. They argued that it was beyond the human mind to understand the universe, and that people should focus on understanding themselves. Remember, two key things about the Sophists. First off, their audience is the aristocracy. They know their audience. They're telling them what they want to hear. They're telling them that the laws of man, these new developments that are happening in the polis system, are oftentimes not to their benefit. They're telling them to look after themselves, basically. The other big criticism of these Sophists by one of our most important philosophers, if not the most important philosophers that develops in classical Greece, Socrates, is the fact that they are accepting money for this. It makes sense. They're traveling around, they have expenses, but Socrates objects to it, as we'll soon see here. 469 to 399 BC, a couple quotes there for you. The unexamined life is not worth living. Know thyself. Socrates was really after inner knowledge. Really what he's talking about here with these first little batch of notes is a self-reflection. Being able to reflect on how you view things and what that means for you. Development of what is known as the Socratic method. It is a method of questioning to seek truth and self-knowledge. Oftentimes what Socrates would do is he'd ask an expert on a subject that they were an expert in. After he asked them to explain it to him, he would take his own mental notes and he would ask them follow-up questions to it. What he really tried to do is he tried to get people to question the knowledge that they knew. Another great quote of Socrates, there are many, is he said, "All I know is that I know nothing." This idea that knowledge is difficult and you have to really question yourself. You can't just take it at face value. You have to examine it. You have to analyze it. He is considered an annoyance and a threat to the way of life in this polis, in Athens, I should say. It's not necessarily what Socrates is saying that gets him in trouble. It's what some of his students are saying. By having his students question themselves, the development of the polis system, you name it, the world around them basically, his students are going to say some things, and it's going to get Socrates in trouble. So when he's 70 years old, he's put on trial for bogus charge of corrupting the city's youth and failing to respect the gods. He speaks out in his own defense. We don't really have any records of Socrates, remember. Up here, he writes no books himself, but he does speak out on his own defense. You're actually going to read it. It's from one of his most famous students, Plato, in the Apology, in which Socrates tries to defend himself. He was loyal to the laws of Athens. He accepts his death, he drinks a glass of poison, a hemlock, and he dies, which is this picture over here that we got for you, this famous fresco. His most famous student and one of the most important philosophers ever, Plato, shocked by the death of his teacher. He's a mentor to Plato, and he ends up leaving Athens for 10 years. Often when he writes, he's not writing on behalf of defense of Athenian democracy. In many ways, in the readings, as you'll see in class, he almost feels like the democracy, the polis system, let him down. When he returned, he establishes the academy, a school that lasts for the next 900 years. Very important. Education, philosophy, these ideas are going to continue because of Plato. Unlike Socrates, Plato's going to write it down. Most of what Plato writes is going to be almost in the form of a conversation, and you'll see this in class, in which Socrates is an active participant in these conversations. He emphasizes the importance of reason. People can recognize perfect beauty and learn to organize an ideal society. He spends a lot of time talking about what an ideal society is, and it's not the society that he sees in Athens at this time. He believes in a world of true forms, whether it was whatever object you can think of. There is a form of it in its truest sense. He also talks a great deal, and you'll see this in class as well. He doesn't trust the senses. He doesn't think we have to almost move past our senses, sight, touch, taste, feel, to really get to the truth of things. His major work is The Republic, a book that describes an ideal state. Society, should be made up of three groups. There are workers, vast majority of people, to produce the necessities of life. There are soldiers. You need soldiers to defend the state. And your philosophers to rule. Now, in talking with these philosophers as the rulers, he categorizes them as reluctant rulers, in which they're not really after power, they're not tyrants, they're not kings who are actively looking to consolidate their power, but it's sort of like, well, hey, we're the educated people, we're the experts on government, philosophy, science, mathematics, whatever. We should be in charge anyway. You don't want... He's basically what he's doing is he's criticizing this idea of Cleisthenes Democratia, where people are chosen by lot, where you can get any knucklehead in there that can all of a sudden make decisions for the whole of society. He's against that. He also sees this, remember, this is a reaction to what happened to his mentor. He was put on trial, and ultimately Socrates, his mentor, lost his life. So you have to keep that in perspective when we discuss what Plato is writing. In his works, he actually addresses women as well. Hey, this is the ancient world. He still doesn't put them on equal footing as men. However, he does believe in the education of some women. He does believe that there are some that can be on par, or in many cases be far more intelligent than some of the men of society. So there is a role for women in this perfect world that he's trying to describe in the Republic. His most famous student, Aristotle, is who we're going to talk about next, and he is also one of the most important philosophers of ancient classical Greece. 384 to 322 BC is our time frame for Aristotle. he develops his own ideas about the best kind of government. What you have to understand about these three that we talk about, Socrates, connected to Plato, connected to Aristotle, they're not always going to agree with each other. He found good and bad examples of all types of government. What Aristotle was really arguing for, and Rome, during the days of the Roman Republic, is really going to apply this pretty well, is to have a mixed form of government. He comes up with this idea of almost a golden mean. He's suspicious of democracy. He thought it led to mob rule. This idea that a large group of people that are in charge of a government could all of a sudden just take over, that mob mentality. Mob mentality is bad. What this golden mean is really talking about is moderation. Moderation in life, moderation in government, moderation in all aspects. Reason, logic should be the guiding force for learning. He spends a lot of time, he sets a rival school to Plato's, the Lyceum. Aristotle spends a lot of time talking about things other than just government. Much of what Plato is focusing on is the ideal state. Aristotle has works on science, philosophy, all sorts of stuff. Not to say that Plato doesn't, but to the extent that, not to the extent that Aristotle does. He spends a great amount of time talking about this idea of the golden mean in nature, in the world around us. He leaves behind many writings. You're going to be looking at Aristotle and his influence, Socrates and Plato as well. His influence is going to be everywhere from the United States Constitution. It's going to be medieval scholastics, looking for logical reasons for explanations for God. I mean, this guy is going to be key to a lot of different arguments that are going to develop. And surprise, surprise, you're going to read him at great length in class, so you know what I'm talking about in a day or two. So that's really just an introduction to your big three as far as Greek philosophy is concerned: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Be ready to read them in class next time. Thanks for listening.